Welcome to Transformational Leadership, the podcast for leaders building high-performance organizations and teams. In every episode, you will hear from executives and transformation experts who've led with vision, executed under pressure, and delivered real, scalable, and impactful results. You'll hear practical insights and leadership stories from executives who've driven change, delivering transformation, and consistently winning in highly complex environments. No fluff, just frameworks, lessons, and stories from the front lines of leadership. If you're serious about building competitive impact through people, you're in the right place. Here is your host, Jeff Harnois.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Transformational Leadership. I'm your host, Jeff Harnois. Today's guest, Billy Parsons, is a Chief Human Resources Officer and Transformational Leader who has over 65 successful M&A integrations in his background and history, and I'm really excited to learn more about that. In today's episode, we're going to focus on a transformation initiative that Billy led with McKinsey in an organization, and we'll get into some of the details around that. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And if you stick with us through the end, we'll hear a little bit about Billy's origin story and backstory, and perhaps even sometime an explanation of some of the time that he had in the Navy. And with that, everyone, please welcome my next guest, Billy, to the stage. Billy, it's really great to have you here today.
Jeff, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Nice to see you. So you had a role as a CHRO, and you were working with McKinsey. Before we jump into the details of that transformation, can you give us maybe a little bit of background about the organization, the size, the scope, and maybe the field of work that they're in?
Yes, they're a healthcare roll-up company,
Mm-hmm.
largest of their sorts in the specialty that they are in.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking 725 plus locations, 18 states, multiple billion in revenue.
Wow, this is a big one. Roughly, how many healthcare professionals employed there?
9,000.
9,000, yeah. This is a good-sized transformation.
Yeah.
And McKinsey had some involvement here.
That's correct. They had a kickoff, and they put the framework together for the entire transformation project, which really encompassed the entire organization. It wasn't a focus on just HR.
I see. And the component you led was the HR work stream transformation and organizational effectiveness. Is that right?
That's right. Most on the executive leadership team had one work stream, typically finance, accounting, marketing. I had HR, which of course makes sense, but I was also asked to lead the organizational effectiveness work stream, which was a little different.
Mm-hmm. Let's jump into this a little bit. So it sounds like the initiative was much larger. The transformation itself was much larger than just HR. And so you were a component of the larger transformation. When I think about transformation, I always think about this from a change management perspective, which is, what is your current state and what was the desired state? Could you give us a little insight into both of those?
I stepped into an HR organization that was built for a call center model instead of a multi-state clinical enterprise.
Mm.
And there was essentially uncontrolled turnover, drifting engagement, inconsistent leadership, and there were also some fractured communication across those 700 plus locations.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we were navigating rapid CEO transitions, shifting executive priorities, and a workforce that was fatigued by constant change at the time.
Oh boy. I'm sorry to pause for just a second here. I have a sense that many of our viewers and listeners are wrestling with issues that are very similar to that.
Yes.
So how did you approach that transformation then? What was your goals?
First of all, I conducted a deep evidence-based review of turnover pattern by role, location, tenure, leader. And I really wanted to reveal predictable hotspots. Built the organization's first real compact people scorecard to track 90-day retention, vacancy burden, time to fill, compensation equity, and that was setting the stage for that. I mapped root causes prior to the McKinsey transformation starting, but it did synergize with the issues that I knew that I had walking in the door. The McKinsey transformation gave an opportunity to frame it with what was going on in the rest of the organization.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When I think about transformation, one of the things that always comes to mind, I mean, we have to think about this, otherwise we're setting ourselves up for failure, is what are things that people are going to resist to? What are the elements of the transformation that people are going to resist most?
Right.
What kind of resistance were you facing?
Change management is also a big issue no matter what. There's going to be competing priorities, especially on the operational side of the organization. Essentially, their day-to-day burdens are always going to be there, from frontline staff members, frontline management, middle tier management, and above. Everyone essentially has their own tasks and projects and priorities that they got to get done. The McKinsey transformation was essentially, especially those involved in the change effort, essentially having a second job. Keep everything running throughout the middle of the day, but also really focus on how do we focus on change, what is necessary to move forward, and then how do also you schedule that and synergize that with what's going on in the rest of the organization.
I can imagine what it would be like to remain in the CHRO role and leading a major transformation initiative like this. How long did that go on?
It went on for the entire transformation, went on for about a year and a half.
Wow. I bet you were exhausted after that experience.
Everyone involved was exhausted. And of course, I worked with the team. I had a team of highly qualified senior directors and VPs working with me.
Sure.
And the big thing was staying on target, and it was my responsibility to head the strategy of everything we're doing and make sure, again, that we're on target and we prioritize the right things.
Yeah. I want to go back to that question of resistance. What you said was your initial approach was you stratified the audience basically by level in the organization. That makes a ton of sense to me. That allows you to customize messaging and adjust messaging based on resistance at the level. What other kinds of resistance did you see or did you have to deal with directly?
There was cultural friction, especially since the company just completed large-scale M&A. So we had some organizations within the company that were, again, a little isolated from where they were and where we wanted the organization to be. So cultural friction, there was operational noise because there were other things going on in the company. And we essentially had weak feedback loops as well. So it was necessary at that point to interview frontline teams, clinicians, our field leaders, to understand exactly where the trust gaps were, but also from their perspective, what really need to be prioritized.
I'm a really big fan of the feedback loop concept in a transformation. The constant check-ins, one, give you early warning if you're heading in the wrong direction or you're about to, set off some tripwires. But it also allows you to position the work and the messaging to be much more effective in the audience. So that initial assessment took place. You got down to some root cause resistance. How did you approach it?
First thing I looked at is, what barriers do I have to get there? What are my constraints?
Yeah.
Are they structural? Are they people-based? Are they communication-based? And essentially, what was my budget for changes? And what was the goal, essentially led by the CEO? What were we trying to do during this entire transformation? There was a centralized focus of being more effective, being more cost effective, but also staying on target with our revenue goals.
Yeah. I've heard this analogy, many people have, but when I think about large scale transformations like this, it really applies. And it's this idea of changing a flat tire on a moving car. you still have to continue to operate the business, even though you're trying to make this major change. I'm sure it felt a bit like that while you were going through it.
It always does that when you're making
Mhm.
large changes to an organization, especially systems, and there are a lot of changes. The biggest one of those really, again, is around prioritization and sequencing. It's it's very easy to step on toes of other executive leadership, what they're trying to do, which is why I always try to co-own any of the major changes between HR and finance or operations, marketing, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So back to dealing with some of the resistance. Um, how did you measure your success when it comes to dealing with resistance? And let me ask another question as well, just a couple onto that. How were you categorizing the types of resistance? How did you think about that?
The first thing I did is looked at the structure of the organization. What were the sight lines from beginning to end? Essentially, how were people communicating what they were doing on the front lines all the way through the corporate structure?
Mm.
What touch points were missing? What gaps were there? Some of the resistance was simply just a lack of communication, a lack of
Oh,
information hitting the right people at the right time. So that
mhm.
was a big part of it. Initially, we at the time were still going through a transition from the Google to the Microsoft platform. So we had actual structural issues of even if we want to send an email, I want to send an email to everyone in the company, I really couldn't do that at the time. So
Oh,
that was part of one of the flat wheels that I was dealing with.
and so once those issues got solved, what was the effect? What did that look like?
First of all, in order to fix that, I actually had to bring in the company's first true intranet, a SharePoint version of intranet.
Yeah.
The purpose of that really was set a lot of the foundational needs in order to get everyone to see the same thing, hear, be a part of everything at the same time, to see essentially anything that was upcoming. We could broadcast it. We let them know in advance. We let them see the impact of what we were doing as we were doing it again and again, scheduling and sequences of events. So
Hmm.
it was really effective to make sure that we can communicate properly. Everybody understood where we're trying to go and what impact it was going to have on them.
Mm. Did you see an effect on adoption rates or lowering resistance? What did that look like?
Yes and no. This transformation was across the board affecting every single aspect of the company.
Hmm.
So there was times in which we would experience fatigue, change
Hmm.
fatigue, or
Hmm.
messaging fatigue. And we started the whole process out, and this is one of the questions you asked. How did I measure this? There was an engagement survey that was actually propagated by McKinsey, in which we went through together. And essentially, it was a very large scale, 135 question survey, very involved. And that kicked off a lot of the direction that we need to go as far as
Hmm.
where was the organization lacking effectiveness? What was the ineffectiveness? Like what were they structural? Were they leadership, etc.? That helped us to find where we wanted to go. But at the same time, it also kicked off a little bit of fatigue because that's a very large, long survey. And the messaging was we're going to be quite involved in what we're doing moving forward. There was some good adoption. It normally happened after we completed a major phase of the transformation, and they started, including the folks on the front line, started feeling the efficacy of our efforts.
Hmm. Mm. This idea of the feedback loop that you talked about, obviously in my mind, key to what we do.
Right.
But one of the key risks in having a robust feedback system is survey fatigue. People often they get tired of giving the feedback, and that becomes a compounding effect on the either the pace or the volume of change that we're trying to get done. So that's a really interesting balancing act. How often did you administer that survey? Was it just once, or were there many pulse check-ins along the way, or what did that look like?
First, in order to sidestep some of that, I want to mention the fact that I created a group of managers, and I called this group the Dirty Dozen. And these were frontline and middle level managers, typically on the operational side. And instead of going to the broader pool of the organization, I would a lot of times, especially when it came to before we were getting ready to initiate changes, I would rinse whatever those changes were, whether it was policy, a procedure, a platform change, processes, etc. I would rinse it through this group of a dozen managers to see how it looked from an operational standpoint,
Mm.
and can we adjust it, because I always sent a draft to this group. I gave them free rein to come back with specific feedback, specific advice. And sometimes they would, as a group, put their foot down and say, this is not something we can do, or this, you're not going to get a lot of impact for this, or this is not the right time. So a lot of times I had an extreme co-ownership with a lot of things I was doing. And I had a really good feedback mechanism from just this small group. And they were very anxious to provide that because they'd never been given that kind of a sounding board and that kind of flexible interaction in the past. So that turned out to be quite effective.
Yeah. And I just want to respond to that. That approach is so smart. It's so smart. Bring in a group of your core SMEs, maybe not limited to just subject matter expertise. We would look for people who were, on the informal communication network, those who are more influential in the organization. We would want to stress test ideas or directions or strategies with them. But once we got to a place where we had made a decision and we're ready to move forward, going back to those folks and asking them to amplify the benefits and, loosely translated, the why buy message for the transformation, again, is really smart. It helps amplify the messaging that we're trying to get across in the organization, usually by these quote unquote influencers in the organization. I love the way that you were thinking about that. I love the way you used that asset in this transformation. I'm assuming that they probably helped you with some of the heavy lifting then too. Is that right?
Yes. Now, first of all, what we did was we made this group of people very prominent in the organization. We gave them a profile. We made it very apparent to everybody that if they had an idea, they could reach back to these managers about anything that we're planning on doing. That way we got an amplifying effect from the feedback. And yes, they were very helpful in shaping what we were doing. And they were also co-owners, like you said, of the messaging, of the disposition. And they had a lot of credibility, and some credibility I don't have because I'm not on the front lines, not in the middle of things. And they were quite helpful and would be advocates for what we're putting out there.
Yeah, again, I love the fact that you, and I don't know where that came from, but instinctively, the thought about adding people who were not officially accountable for the transformation, but were supporting it nonetheless.
That's right. I expanded that to something broader a little further down the road, to something I call the Employee Experience Council.
Okay.
The Employee Experience Council was a group of 30 only frontline employees. These were people who worked front desk, they were clinicians on the front lines. And essentially, this was a group that gave us a different perspective. When we put something out there, how was it being communicated? How was it being taken? We may have thought it was a very solid rollout of a program, only to find out from this group that it didn't work as effective as we did, or we didn't communicate very well, or we didn't sequence it very well, where it came out at a time where they were already stressed about some other changes going on in the organization. But a lot of times we did get really good feedback, and we gave them a profile and we gave them a stage as well, so that others in the same kind of role that they were in could essentially reach out to them, like members of Congress, So they represented a lot of the people on the front lines and these are the people who deal with all the patients and customers, deal with all the processes, especially the micro processes on the front end. And we're really responsible for the day-to-day image of the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And again, I would call it the intelligence and the intelligent approach to leveraging resources in the organization to accomplish this transformation is brilliant. At the top of the conversation, one of the things that you said about this transformation is the history, the previous current state of the organization was one that was very call center or call centric based.
Right.
And you transformed it into more of a, how would you describe the desired future state for that transformation?
To your point, I walked into more of a centralized help desk aspect of HR where, and when I did my listening tour and I first got there, essentially it was a black hole of questions. Questions would come in, the answers would come out typically, but there was no ownership, there was no understanding of timing or prioritization. So I did have to reorganize the HR function into more of a regional HR business partner structure, which had all the elements, but just wasn't in the same, it wasn't really optimized for what I was going for. And at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, I eliminated a little bit of duplication, including one of the VP roles that were simply unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think ultimately this transformation, actually, before I move on to those questions, let me ask you, so you were trying to transition out of that centralized approach to a decentralized approach. Is that the right way to think about this?
Very much so.
And when you think about patient experience or the goals of the organization, or maybe even more specifically, the goals of this transformation, how did that map out?
The goal for this HR function, which is typical for most HR functions, is how do we resolve issues for typically our operational group, which drives revenue? How do we solve issues for them so they can focus on the job they're really hired to do? So the idea
Mm-hmm.
was, as questions came in, how we make it easier to put in their queries? How was ownership established? In other words, a name and a face. And how did that person who then own their issues make sure that whoever they had to contact internally, they owned it from beginning to end, and they were the primary point of contact.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is solve it so they can get back to their work, because people in all organizations, unless they were hired in HR, they weren't hired to work on benefits. They were not hired to work on employee relations issues. They were not hired on any of the things that require administrative or even bureaucratic efforts in the
Mm-hmm.
background.
In industry, one of the themes, for lack of a better term here, when I speak to other CHROs, is really this idea of manager and leader enablement.
Right.
Can we, to your point, create a sense of ownership, not only of the business, but also of the employee experience and employee efficacy, or higher engagement and all of that? But in healthcare, it's a little different. And what I mean by that is, when it may not be manager or leader empowerment, it may be care provider empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
And when you successfully accomplish that, I have to think that the quality of care and the standard of care that patients are receiving is higher. Is there a connection to that in this transformation?
Most certainly. First of all, fortunately, healthcare has a built-in mission, regardless of your own company's mission, vision, and values. Its mission is always built in, which is saving or optimizing patient lives. And knowing
Yeah.
that it's easier that when we're solving issues for the people who actually provide patient care or facilitate efforts for those who really provide the care, knowing that is really one of the reasons why HR can be so effective. It
Mm-hmm.
reduces liability, it makes things easier, adds additional value, and essentially is sometimes the heart of the organization because we clear the way for those who are here to provide that kind of care.
Mm-hmm. Was there any measurement component? This is just intellectual curiosity. Was there any measurement component? We can measure employee engagement. That's a relatively easy one to do, but at the outcome level, at the patient level, was there any sort of measurement or indications that the standard of care or the care they were receiving was better after post-transformation?
Yes, we did have net promoter scores
You did.
in our business units. We did
Yeah.
have those. Those remained steady or improved. We already had very high NPR scores, but they did improve afterwards by a couple of points. And the reason I say a couple of points is because we reached the saturation point of how high your scores could even go. So we
Yeah,
have
that's
a
right.
lot of room to go.
Yeah, the higher you go, the harder it is to grow. Yeah, that's always a point of resistance that if we had a magic wand and could solve for, we would solve world hunger thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Nice. This is an excellent story. I'd love to get your sort of top line history is often friendly in retrospect. When you're in it, right? When you're in the fight, it's usually rough, it's hard, it's challenging, it's all of those things. But time has a tendency to maybe soften some of those sharper edges. I'd love to just ask you in retrospect, as you look at this experience that we're describing, what are some of your fondest memories of that transformation?
First of all, leaning back and really starting the foundational elements, some of the changes that were absolutely essential. For instance, going from 900 titles to less than half of that, putting everyone on the same job description, building a compensation structure that are 15 tiers, including through the C-suite, building career pathways, doing talent assessments for the senior levels of the organization.
Yeah.
Those are all very foundational because they had never ever occurred before, including 360s for the C-suite.
Mm.
Those were very satisfying, but the real satisfying issues were they were also originally put in place that had never existed, but they had true impact. So I'll give you some examples of that. We put in an on-demand pay system. And essentially, what that meant was, especially for the hourly employees who make between perhaps $17 and $22 an hour,
Mm-hmm.
which also represented the bulk of high turnover at the time, we were able to put in a on-demand pay system in which, instead of getting paid biweekly every other Friday, the system allowed them to get paid for up to 50% of completed work. So in a nutshell, it allowed them to get paid on demand every Friday. They would get their normal paycheck
Wow.
every other Friday, but in between that, they would get half of a paycheck. So essentially, every Friday they got paid, and that created security of pay. It met week by week needs. It really helped their families. We had tons of testimonials coming back that just really emphasize the impact of that, including parents being able to afford school supplies when they really
Yeah.
needed them, or being able to put on a sudden birthday party because their family changes had occurred. And it was really impactful, especially that on-demand pay system. And there were some other things
Wow.
as well that were very satisfying.
I'd like to hover here for just a second. This is actually the first time that I've heard, especially an organization of this size, have this kind of creative compensation distribution system, for lack of a better word there. My brain, I'm certain, would be lighting up if we were doing an fMRI right now around this concept, and especially for that tier of employee, $17 to $22.
Mm-hmm.
how important having access to their compensation sooner. Wow. See, again, my brain is going crazy on this. That must have had a direct effect on engagement. It must have had a direct effect on retention. It must have had an impact on an E and NPS score.
Yep.
Tell me about those, if you have any of those measurements in place.
First of all, walking into this organization, we had incredibly high turnover for a lot of different reasons. So can't get to
Yeah.
more of all that. But putting programs like this and a few others that we've yet to talk about, turnover in 1 year reduced by 11%.
That's a big number.
It's a very large number, especially for this organization. And over the first year of this transformation, engagement went up 24%.
That's huge. Those are two absolutely stellar metrics. That's phenomenal. You alluded to a couple of other things that were really cool. Tell me about those.
We did an entire organizational upskilling program. This is the first time the organization ever did large scale learning and development. And essentially, what it was going through uh, optimal workforce practices. This was making sure we had the same languages, making sure that we had the same insights. In other words, what's important about meetings, what's important about using time effectively, patient-centered care, a lot of the elements essentially of how do we move as an organization, have the same insights of the organization, how can we work as a broader team, not just locally, but throughout the chain of the organization, how do we communicate more effectively, especially using the same terminology.
Yeah.
That was a 6-month odyssey in which we trained a lot of super users. They then trained 700 plus leaders, and those leaders then took charge of individual trainings on the local level, including some digital resources.
Yeah, again, I love everything about this story. This is the center lane for iBridged and what we do. We want to have that common language, and we use some psychometrics to really bridge some of those communication types of gaps, helping people understand how better to communicate, how to be more effective in communication. We overlay that with some behavioral models so that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time. And then we overlay that with some standardized operational models. And what we find is that not only are those teams performing at a much, much higher level than the previous state, but they're enjoying the work and the people even more, which then downstream leads to better engagement and better retention. It means the institution isn't losing that institutional knowledge as people are turning over, and the expense of replacing and the opportunity costs. So again, the fact that you are leaning in on this is spectacular from my perspective.
What we also did was, and this was not so much on the front lines, but we put in a position management system. This was great for finance and operation to actually do more effective forecasting, because then every person in the organization had a designated and approved seat. One of the aspects of this was it pulled, for instance, contractors out of the AP function because they had to have an approved seat as well. And it really helped us standardize and normalize what our workforce management really looked like.
Okay.
And what was the underlying cost. That was effective. It didn't affect everybody on the front lines, but it was incredibly necessary to put that structure together. But probably one of the more impactful things, if not the most impactful thing, was a recognition platform that we put in place.
Yes. Tell me more about that.
Well, when I got to this organization, we had a very manual, like other organizations do initially, a very manual email-based recognition system, which someone would email a generic email. It was handled administratively, and there were nice things and complimentary messages and whatnot that went back to someone else in the organization and we spotlighted and profiled those, but it was very manual. And we were only getting, for an organization of 9,000, we were only getting about 100 a month. So the idea was putting a recognition platform in place that met multiple criteria, especially criteria that I wanted to hit. And before I get to the impact, one of the things that I really wanted to do, and in my opinion, every recognition platform should have a bottom line component. In other words, it should increase engagement, it should reduce turnover, and it should also focus on revenue. And the reason I say this is once people are engaged, you get more discretionary effort. Once you lower turnover, you have more consistency and support, especially in this organization, our revenue drivers are doctors. The more patients they see, the more revenue and more stability we have in revenue. With a high turnover, you are essentially asking these doctors to constantly adapt to new people coming in the organization. That reduces their effectiveness. It reduces the amount of patients that they can see. So a recognition platform increases engagement, lowers turnover, creates a sense of one culture, which is another goal. So there is huge bottom line components. So not only did I bring a recognition platform in, but I customized it even more than the vendor had built it for. And the idea was anyone in the organization can give recognitions, including our patients. So essentially, if I can go into the structure a little bit, it's a points-based system. Points are actually important. I'll explain why in a minute. But a peer-to-peer recognition can occur within the system, but it generates no points. A manager can recognize a subordinate or anyone else in the organization, and that's worth 2 points.
Okay.
And that's important because I'll get to the points in just a minute.
Yeah.
But with a QR code in every location, a patient can also hit that with their phone, bring up the QR code, and recognize someone in our actual clinics and locations. But the bigger one, and it actually coincides with how important the patient is, but also doctors. Doctors can also recognize anyone in the staff, anyone who supports them. And those are both worth 5 points. So patients and doctors provide more benefit when they recognize someone than the manager. And now it all evens out because the manager is going to see more opportunities to actually recognize someone. But the idea is a flywheel effect. If our team members are making patients happy or they're making doctors happy, in turn, they get recognized, and they get recognized on a multiplier of 2.5. So essentially, or 1.5. So every time they make a doctor happy, they get more points. They make a patient happy, they get more points. And eventually they're going to want to make these groups happier. And anytime we get a doctor who's being constantly super served by our own team members because they want to be recognized and there's a value to it, that's a win-win because and again, anytime our doctors are more engaged, the staff member is more engaged, you create more of a seamless, tight team environment. So that was all the point of that. And essentially, this platform was easy to use. It was social media based. It looked like Facebook or LinkedIn. There were animated GIFs, emojis, pictures, and then it also came with automated celebrations for birthdays and service anniversaries.
Yeah.
But it was a big thing because you can also put team photos in there, and everybody had a really awesome time of the back and forth. But here's the impact. When we turned this system on, we were getting 100 recognitions a month. When we turned the system on the very first month, we got over 2,000 recognitions.
Wow.
And in the first quarter, we had over 10,000 recognitions, and 1,500 of those were from patients. That's just getting the system started.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I said, wow, when you said that. The thought that went through my head was, in some cases, the organization was already performing well, but there was no mechanism to capture that energy, that positivity, and transfer it back to where the source. And it sounds to me like this particular platform really unlocked that pent up demand for recognition or wanting to give recognition and then operationalized it. This is a really cool feature. I had not thought about that in depth. And of course, now I'm thinking across my entire client spectrum and how a system like this might be really beneficial to them. What a cool thing. So outside of the metrics here, how give me your perspective on what you and what you feel about that particular initiative.
What it did is it created a more unified company culture. It was the first time that we had a platform everyone was using at the same time, cross locations. And one of the ways that I also put this in place was I created operational regions, which was before. The way the company worked is, again, you'd have these large organizations or locations, and they were insulated from anyone else in that, even in that geographic space that they were in. What I did was I co-owned and worked with the operational group, and they actually regionalized a lot. So they started pulling some of these locations together, all the locations together, until they had regional titles underneath them. And the reason that's important is because, remember, this is a points-based system. I would then, on a monthly basis, have tallies for each of these operational regions. We had 9, and then they were competing against each other in point totals.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, so there was some gamification that was going on
Yeah.
there, but there was also some pride that was built that wasn't there before, because now all of a sudden you have all these different locations, for instance, in the Cincinnati area that really didn't even talk to each other, but all of a sudden they're on the same team.
Mm-hmm.
And that's helping build a regional personality, but also now they're competing across the organization, which is more, again, a company identity. And it was incredibly effective. The points really told us who was engaged, who was not. And in some ways, we were able to give really solid metric information to our upper tier operational senior leadership, where they knew engagement was taking place or wasn't taking place in some areas. And they were able to engage those leaders, ask them what the what hesitancy they had for using it, or
Yep.
what would bring it top to mind. But they were also able to show the efficacy, and also they were able to use a little peer pressure and say, this region over here is using it just fine, and they are structured very similar to the way you all are. So you want to get in the game and get some spirit, because, and I'll wrap this up, the points were used at an internal company lottery.
Mm-hmm.
And the more points someone got, the more entries they got into this raffle.
Yeah.
And
Love that.
ultimately, there were rewards being promulgated throughout the organization, and regions weren't getting as many rewards either because they weren't given as many recognition points.
Mm-hmm.
So it all helped develop this ecosystem of recognition that honestly could not have worked out any better than I wanted it to.
Yeah, and I think that summary is really good too, because it brings up the hooks or the levers that can be applied in cultural levels of transformation.
Yeah.
It supports operational levels of transformation. It supports quality and standard level transformation.
Yes.
Ultimately, all of that leading to better customer, in this case, patient experiences, which I think at the end of the day is ultimately the goal. This has been phenomenal, Billy. I have enjoyed the conversation tremendously. The insights, I learn something or I get a new perspective every time I have one of these conversations. You've given me a couple today. Thank you for that. I like to ask my guests a couple of questions, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you had advice for somebody coming up in HR, what would be if you only had the opportunity to give them one piece of advice, what would that be?
jump into your next opportunity, regardless of whether or not you think you're qualified or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I think a really close cousin to that is you may be anxious about it or even fearful, but do it anyway is one of mine that I think follows into that same role. Do it anyway and see what and learn what you learn. It's always better than what you think it would be. And then I just have to tell you, this is one of my favorite questions. And again, I haven't prepped you on this, so we're going to get it completely organically. What's the best piece of advice you received and didn't take?
That's some very good questions. One, probably closely vet where you're going, because it's easy to jump in an organization that needs you, but it's another thing to jump into an organization that will appreciate you.
Huh. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. I love that. Billy, if somebody wanted to reach out to you, would LinkedIn be a good place for them to contact you?
Absolutely. Very easy to find, and I welcome just about anybody who wants to contact me.
Okay. So it sounds like you're open to having people reach out, and if they've got questions about what we've talked about today, or if they're trying to implement these kinds of strategies in their own organizations,
Absolutely.
you're open to that. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Billy, thank you so much for the time today. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, really deep and rich, and I appreciate your time and engagement today.
I appreciate that. Being like I am in transition, looking for my next CHRO role, this is an excellent opportunity to be able to chat with you and the rest of the organization, the rest of the community.
Yeah, awesome. Billy, thanks. We'll talk again soon.
All right. Thank you.
Yep, take care.
The Transformational Leadership Podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes vision, action, diagnostics, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, be sure to let us know in the comments. We'd love you to join the conversation and help us transform the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are transforming organizations, leaders, and teams. In the meantime, be sure to like, subscribe, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.